This is Dr. Wysong. This series of videos on the big questions of life will show where each one of us is led if we dare to leave behind preconceived ideas and see where reason and evidence lead.
Are we selected mutants? The engine that's supposed to propel evolution needs to have the muscle for shape-shifting one kind of creature into another. That engine is described as neo-Darwinism, the combination of mutations to create genetic variations, and natural selection to winnow out the fittest variants. An immediate problem arises in that this mechanism must explain all features of all creatures in every environment. The fin of the fish and the legs of the crab must both be explained by water. The short neck of the elephant and the long neck of the giraffe must both be explained by leaf food, and so on through all of nature. Obviously, evolution is not very selective or powerful, since every environment niche contains myriad creatures of different shapes, colors, and abilities. On the same piece of geography can be found bacteria, insects, fish, reptiles, amphibians, birds, mammals, all manner of creature in every imaginable color, size, and configuration. If evolution were true, there would just be one most fit, naturally selected creature. If natural selection effectively dictated form and function, the desert would have one kind of creature, the ocean another, the forest another, and the air yet another. Instead, there are millions of varieties in each of these habitats, about 9 million total species. This effectively denies that evolution is a powerful and exacting force sufficient to explain the biological world. Sometimes there is variation in response to environmental pressure, but such variation is subtle and never does something like create a new beneficial organ or whole new creatures. The remarkable variation that exists in the world, frankly, fits better creative ingenuity and even artistic flair. Each step and detail must be explained. Consider just the eyelid. It includes skin cells, muscles, nerves, blood vessels, lymphatics, connective tissue, mucosal tissue, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, lashes, hormones, immune cells, and so forth, all arranged in a precise three-dimensional shape and wired and plumbed to the rest of the body so that it can function both voluntarily and on autopilot. Each of those parts, in turn, has millions of cell, organelle, and biochemical parts. Every single detail, down to the placement of each atom, must be accounted for by evolutionists. But explaining such detail has never been done other than in very broad and sweeping terms such as, and I quote, "The eyelid evolved because it was necessary to protect and lubricate the eye. Those with lids were more fit than those without them. Thus our lidded ancestors had a selective advantage." End quote. Such simplistic storytelling is conjecture and doesn't explain the origin and transformation of any of the millions of the components. Irreducible complexity. Evolution assumes that life is a mere summation of parts, a philosophy known as materialistic reductionism. Thus, like machines, organisms are thought to be understood by taking them apart. Such exploration has revealed some aspects of how living things work, but does not point to evolutionary origin. That's because functional things are irreducibly complex. Mutate, that is, remove or add, parts and creatures either do not work, they die, or become less functional, or diseased. Yet all evolutionary precursors supposedly had less developed and thus non-functional parts. Thus, living things cannot evolve. Add and remove parts, that is. They are, in fact, irreducibly complex, and thus could not mutate to be less or more than what they are. Mutations are not nice things. Evolutionists refer to mutations as though they are an explanatory holy grail. Recall the teacher claiming to the class that the beginning of the universe is no big deal, saying, "First you start with some dust," and a student interrupts, "Hey, wait, get your own dust." Similarly, evolutionists claim there is no mystery to the panoply of life and say, "First you take some DNA, then you mutate it," but mutations don't create DNA starting materials. So we should respond, "Hey, wait, get your own DNA." But they are woefully unable to account for any of it, much less the human genome containing the equivalent of the information in 3 quadrillion fact-filled books. Mutations must be called upon again and again to create complex and beneficial changes, but mutations are a random disruption of the information contained in DNA. Random changes to information, as the law of information dictates, result in degradation, not improvement. The pressure in nature is always from complex to random, no matter how much natural selection is applied. That's why, in practice, mutations are essentially 100% lethal or disadvantageous. In humans, mutations are linked to dwarfism, albinism, Huntington's chorea, Down syndrome, cystic fibrosis, familial hypercholesterolemia, and cancer, to only begin the list of hundreds. The inability or reduced capacity of humans to synthesize certain nutrients, such as the 22 essential amino acids, vitamins, long-chain fatty acids, antioxidants, and others without which we suffer disease and death, is most likely traceable to mutational damage to the genome. For example, the essentiality of vitamin C is traced to a mutation in the gulo, that's the gulanolactone oxidase gene. Minus this vitamin in our diet, scurvy and an array of pleomorphic, that is, various form, diseases and weaknesses occur. At our beginning, unspoiled by mutational damage, we were likely far more nutritionally self-sufficient. Cancer is now devastating modern society, with 1,600 people in the United States and 21,000 people worldwide dying from it each day. Causes ultimately relate to disrupted normal metabolism or altered genetics. All carcinogens, that's chemicals that cause cancer, are mutagens. For the same reasons you don't want to store nuclear waste under your bed, you don't want an existence driven by mutations. There's not one example of a beneficial mutation that increases the functional complexity of an organism. An increase in functional complexity, which is needed for evolution in the molecule-to-man sense, shouldn't be confused with mutations that may increase survivability. For example, the AIDS virus is thought to mutate resistance to drugs, but the AIDS virus doesn't become something more complex, such as a bacterium or a protozoan. If given reprieve from the drugs, it will just revert to the original wild type. In fact, it may not even be mutations that create such resistance. Epigenetics demonstrates that new characteristics in organisms are not new and are not mutations, but rather the molecular switching on and off of existing genetic codes. The anti-evolution DNA mechanism. Living tissue is constantly subjected to mutagenic forces such as ionizing radiation, cosmic rays, and chemicals. Each day, thousands of mutations occur in our tissues. We wouldn't survive if not for DNA repair mechanisms. These biochemical systems within cells have the ability to detect, excise, and repair mutations. And this is no small sneeze of an effort by the body to avoid mutations, since there's some 4,600 biochemicals engaged in DNA repair. So think of that. We live day to day because we have automatic mechanisms that repair mutations. These repair mechanisms not only help keep us alive, but they also lock creatures into what they are. They are evolution preventers, and our survival depends on them. The ultimate survivor. Fast reproducing microorganisms have a high mutation rate and should have long ago evolved out of their single-celled retardation. They should no longer exist, but they do, and they look just like their progenitors. It doesn't matter how far back in time we go or how many trillions of reproductive cycles occur. Recall the 3.8 billion year old stromatolite bacteria that still exist today, unchanged. Since survivability is a thesis of evolution, life should have stayed as microbes, not evolved into more specialized and thus more vulnerable creatures. Better yet, life should have not even begun, since the inorganic elements of which they are composed are virtually indestructible. Better even yet, stay just energy that is totally indestructible. The missing links. If evolution is true, the world should abound with transitional mutated organs and organisms. There should be no need to search for so-called missing links, since they would be everywhere in the fossil record and alive today. Forming new organs would require millions of transitional steps because billions of different chemical parts need to be developed, transformed, and interlinked with one another. These steps should be clearly evident everywhere in living and fossilized creatures in countless gradations. Given evolution, it would now be impossible to clearly differentiate one sort of creature from another. But no, the biota is not a blur, but rather demarcated by distinct, recognizable, and well-developed forms called syngamions. These remain true to their kind. Humans stay humans, chimps stay chimps, dogs stay dogs. Calling the transitions. If a step occurred toward a new trait, but was not functional and advantageous, it would make the organism less fit. A budding wing can't know that a million years hence it will be a functional flight organ if it just hangs in there. Instead, natural selection will cull out organisms with useless appendages that are in the developmental stages. There's no survival value of a nub destined to be a wing in a million years or so, or a flopping appendage that has a few scraggly wannabe feathers emerging here and there. Any random change in an existing organism will make the creature genetically discombobulated, less fit than the form from which it was derived. Natural selection is not the savior, it's a pitiless executioner. Actually everything, but here are some things that are impossible to explain by evolution. There's a plant hopper. It has at one end the perfect shape of a small alligator's head, and has painted on its back the perfect likeness of alligator teeth, eyes, nostrils, and markings. The only obvious purpose is to scare away predators. Evolutionary transitions leading to this likeness would have been amorphous white blotches signaling to predators, "Come eat me." Thus the transitions would have been gobbled up. If there were no transitions, there would be no plant hopper, but there is. There is no mutational or genetic mechanism that could account for such a feature. The only reasonable conclusion is that the likeness was created fully formed. Macaws live in a rainforest that contains some 40,000 varieties of trees. Only about 10 produce edible fruit for the birds. Of the 10, most only bear a few days each year, and some only do so every several years. With no written language or maps, how was the macaw ability to find the right trees developed or transmitted? The capability could not arise by chance mutations and selection. The forest flora would have long ago been fertilized with the exhausted bodies of macaws, waiting for the right mutations, enabling them to find the right 10 trees at the right time of the year. The orb weaver spider lives in the rainforest of Costa Rica. It spins a round orb web. A parasitic wasp can temporarily paralyze the spider by stinging it in the mouth. The wasp then attaches a wasp egg to the spider's abdomen. A larva hatches from the egg, pierces the abdomen of the spider, and dines on the hemolymph, which is the spider blood. The larva knows how to do this in such a way that the spider remains alive long enough to sustain the larva. The night the larva finally kills the spider, it gorges on the remaining contents of the spider and discards the empty shell to the forest floor. But before that grotesque end, the larva communicates instructions to the spider to change its web weaving to a rectangular shape supported by beefed-up cabling. The new web shape accommodates the weight of the wasp larva so it can spin a cocoon to pupate and metamorphose into a wasp to begin the whole cycle all over again. The special web protects the cocoon from heavy rains and the emerging wasp from being entangled in the spider's normal web. Not only is it impossible to explain in detail, step by step, the evolution of such a complex parasitic relationship, it's flabbergasting to attempt an evolutionary explanation of a wasp larva communicating to the spider the new shape of a web to build. So here we have a situation where a spider supposedly evolved to tolerate an egg laid on its abdomen that slowly kills it. But before the spider dies, it does the bidding of the wasp larva and spins a web especially for its executioner to pupate on. The end result is a new wasp that sets about finding other spiders to suck the life out of, boss around, and kill. By natural selection rules, this spider is more fit than its precursors that didn't let wasps kill them or force them to create a hatchery for their killers. Speaking of cocoons, consider the impossibility of a specific step-by-step evolutionary mechanism. Now, when I'm talking about biochemical and genetic detail, not just stories, that would enable a worm to transform itself into a wasp, moth, or butterfly. Even if the mechanism were there, which it's not, where would the desire for such a transformation come from? Not one scientific paper out of the tens of thousands that have appeared monthly for over a century has ever elucidated in detail the answer to such problems, or how evolving partially formed organs and traits escape the brutality of natural selection. The entire biological world is filled with such conundrums. Evolutionists' answer is to ignore them or call them temporary gaps in understanding. The problem is, all of evolution is filled with such gaps. The bottom line is that the astounding complexity of organisms is not explained by evolution, nor would any organism dare change significantly from its functional and surviving self. If anything, natural selection is an excellent mechanism for preventing genetic aberrations, like mutations, from changing, vitiating, or destroying a species. The failure of evidence and lack of any logical mechanism, by Darwin's own words, defeats evolution. In The Origin of Species, he wrote, and I quote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." End quote. Thank you for listening. Keep in mind that solving the big questions requires foundations upon which truthful answers can be built. So please work through the series sequentially. This information has taken decades of research, thought, and writing. Aside from the peace of mind the solutions have brought me, the only reward I seek is hearing that it's helped you. Feel free to contact me with any comments or questions at asifThinkingMatters.com.